Listeners, our media is covered with stories about exploring fantastical worlds, the far-off stars, the oceanic floor, or even our own backyard. Stuff like D&D or Dungeon Meshi is born of this primal urge to explore dangerous and strange landscapes with magical abilities and friends in tow, cooking exotic foods and making new discoveries. I've scoured through games that give me this similar sense of dungeon delving and exploration that I'm fueled by. A proper dungeon crawler like Etrian Odyssey lacks the tactile feel that I'd want to explore a world with. Stuff like Cave Blazers and Catacomb Kids have scratched this itch to an extent, but the one game that has truly immersed me in this feeling of wonder and danger is the one I'm talking about today. Today's Deep Cut is on Vagante. Welcome, listeners! I am Mr. Staleman, and I plan to spoil the length and breadth of Vagante or Vagante, however it's pronounced. Although I am dismissive of the title's pronunciation, believe me when I say this game is on here because it is so close to my heart, and I feel it's a crying shame that more people don't know about it. If I can be brief with the review portion, this game is worthwhile for those that like the procedural generation of dungeon maps and equipment and RPG elements of roguelikes with the exploration and combat of a methodical action platformer. Make no mistake that the game is hard, and your advancements in the game will come from becoming acquainted with its monsters, its traps, and its world layouts, as well as taking advantage of its more obscure systems like cooking, scroll uses, and shrines. It was recently released on Switch around the time I'd finished writing this script, and I'm excited about this development as it means the devs are still active in supporting the game. Play this game and get a couple of friends to play with you. You shouldn't regret it. Vagante's story sees one of 5 distinct classes taking a wagon out to a mysterious cave that holds magical secrets and strange worlds. At least that's all that can really be interpreted from the game, considering how little story there is beyond small context clues and the final boss of the game. Personally, this works to Vagante's advantage, as it gives it a fairy tale folklore vibe. It's not about how the story began or how the story ends, but the journey experienced and the lessons learned along the way. And believe me that you will learn lessons through grit and gristle. You start your journey outside of the cave, going through a tutorial section that shows the fundamentals of gameplay. You can run or walk, jump around, make a basic attack with your weapon, use a ranged weapon, avoid traps like boulders or spikes, and generally traverse the landscape before you. The game does a fantastic job of onboarding the player just enough to get them to understand its foundational elements without revealing some of the more fiddly bits you can discover along the way, like dragging live chickens or dead eyebats to your campfire to burn them for food or vision respectively. I mentioned that the game feels a lot like a dungeon crawler, where the objective is to explore a dungeon without dying and kit yourself up enough to handle the next stage, as well as finding the pathway to the next level. The merit of a game like Vagante is that traversal becomes a dimension of play. Somewhat like Spelunky, you're gauging your jumps and avoiding traps special to each area, be it the boulder traps of the caves, the long precarious falls of the jungle, or the floor spikes of the catacombs. This traversal dimension is diminished somewhat when considering that most of the zones in the game are confined spaces and involve more trap avoidance than treating the act of moving to one side of the stage to another like an obstacle. But my feeling behind this decision is that the developers focused on making the world feel hostile over arduous. The traversal element of the game is also diminished more so whenever you gain access to equipment that lets you phase through walls and floors, avoid those pesky spike traps, acquire immunity to boulder traps, dig holes, etc. But I don't mind that as much when you take into consideration these items only become accessible when you explore the dungeon for chests and generate one, and depending on the stats of these items and the inventory size to contend with, you might be better off dealing with a more hostile environment in favor of better equipment. Vagante is special to me in its cooperative elements. This game is slow-paced enough and thoughtful enough that someone that has never played a game before can ease themselves into the hobby with the help of a gamer. I played this game a lot with my ex when we were in college during a time I was attempting to get her into the hobby of video games, and we found this game to be our favorite pastime. She'd scream whenever she fell long distances and spam her basic spells so I could finish them off, and before we knew it, the walls of the computer screen melted away and we were just adventurers looking for chickens to cook, mutton in the walls, fairies to save, and magic items to make dealing with the catacombs a bearable experience. As a solo experience, this feeling remained. I would select a random character, see what new adventure I was inhabiting this session, and maneuver my way from area to area in an increasingly hostile environment in search of identified scrolls and mysterious potions holding potential stat buffs. But a dungeon delve is not just avoiding traps and maneuvering around terrain. No, no, no. Sometimes an adventurer has to get their hands dirty and pummel a couple of heads. Combat in Vagante can be separated into 3 categories: melee, physical ranged, and magic. Mechanically, the combat is purposeful, with smaller weapons like daggers and claws having shorter uptimes for spammability, but a short melee range to attack from, to the large and unwieldy axes, requiring not only the player time their attack with this long overhead swing, but properly catch the enemy with the bladed section of the weapon, or lose out on the bulk of its damage. In the melee corner, we have daggers, fists, swords, clubs, and axes, and staffs if you're running around as a melee mage on full enchanter and staff buffs. Daggers and fists, as mentioned, are short-ranged, fast-acting weapons, dealing small amounts of damage with low variance. Swords have a longer range when stabbing forward, dealing a moderate amount of damage with a medium amount of variance. Their attack speed can be affected by the kind of sword you're stabbing with, but fall mostly under the category of slightly sluggish. Clubs have a shorter range but benefit from an overhead swing, requiring less maneuverability on your part to hit the enemy. Beyond its attack pattern, they generally swing slower than the sword, but have slightly increased damage values. Axes are slow lumbering weapons that require the player to properly hit the monsters with the bladed end, but when you do, you're dealing a massive amount of damage. Staffs are a special kind of weapon, dealing a low amount of physical damage, but having fast swing speeds with an overhead swing. The special skill on staffs is that holding the attack button allows you to let loose a staff-specific spell, be it a rainbow wave, a shimmering ball, or twin skulls. These abilities are charge-based, and the staff replenishes charges when you hit an enemy with your basic attack. Outside of the realm of melee are the physical ranged weapons, requiring arrows to knock or a trusty boomerang to come back to you. We've got a short and long bow, a crossbow, and a boomerang. The short and long bow line play the exact same way, with the long bow being better than the short bow in every way. Really, the granularity can come from comparing the longbow to the crossbow, but that comparison is lacking too because the crossbow is just bad. Your first animation is loading an arrow into the crossbow and then shooting it with a second action. Just the one arrow. If you find that you need to be dealing consistent damage at a distance, this lag time is going to see you getting hurt or killed in the long run. Compared to the bow line, where you're shooting arrows as quickly as you can launch them within one action, and you're left wondering what benefit the crossbow provides that the bows cannot. The boomerang is a last resort ranged weapon that can return to you if you're lucky, but if it hits an obstacle along the way, it drops to the floor. It's the only weapon I can think of that also doesn't come with any attributes like the other spawned weapons, meaning that they quickly pale compared to the weapons you can find that confer stat benefits even if you're not using the weapon. And beyond the physical ranged weapons are the spells players can cast. Most spells are charge-based, meaning you have a limited number of casts with each spell per level before it runs out. They're also concentration-based, meaning stronger spells require the player to take more time preparing the spell before it's let loose, and being hit causes most spells to fizzle and the charge to be used up. The only spell that does not have a casting limit is the Electric Lance, which is a short-range spell shot in front of the character. Beyond this spell are stuff like Frost Nova, a spell cast around the player that freezes nearby opponents, Flame Pillar, which shoots out a gout of fire directly in front of you, Dash, which gives you a burst of movement in a direction of your choice, and more. Each spell has a level as well, meaning that finding multiple copies of the same spell is valuable. Each level you add onto the spell increases its charge amount and damage, and if you read a book 3 times, the spell evolves into a more potent version of itself, like Electric Lance doubling in range or Ice Ball casting 3 projectiles instead of 1. Anyone can read a book given they're not illiterate, and thus anyone can cast a spell. But as mentioned earlier in the broadcast, this is an RPG. The player has stats that are affected by the equipment you find and points allocated from level ups. In order, we have Strength, Dexterity, Intelligence, Luck, and Vitality. Strength increases the damage for melee weapons by a lot and ranged weapons by a lesser amount. Dexterity does the opposite, increasing ranged weapons by a lot and melee weapons by a little. Intelligence affects spell charge capacity and spell damage. Luck increases the rarity of items found in chests, the quality of stats found in those items, and critical hit values. And Vitality affects your health bar, with each point increasing your health in increments of 10. And each class starts with a base stat spread, meaning that they excel in certain skills right out of the gate over others, beyond having their archetypal skills to invest in. This is where the dungeon crawling roguelike elements begin to shine, because now you're not just picking what weapons are interesting to you, but whether what you're holding has beneficial stats for the playstyle you're running. I'm omitting armor out of this at the moment, so just looking at the weapons, you might find a dagger with the envenom property, a strong ability to proc poison on an enemy without the poison disappearing off the weapon, but be hindered with a negative stat point. Because of this negative stat point, it might lower your potential damage or weaken your health, meaning you're taking risks by wielding the weapon. Expanding further to include equipment here and their abilities, be it the aforementioned phasing abilities, dealing a type of damage to enemies that have damaged you, or allowing you to breathe underwater, the game very quickly has its dungeon crawling roots show up to force the player to itemize and hoard items for whatever situation may occur. Keep a cap of boulder protection even if the stats are poor to prevent the auto death that can come from this monster or that monster. Wear an amulet of death protection even if the stats are poor, because the second chance to correct a mistake is tantamount to getting to the end. In total, your character is wearing something on their head, arms, chest, and legs, with 2 ring slots and an amulet slot. That means that over the course of a run, you're mixing and matching gear you find for optimal builds across 9 different avenues for stat manipulations. And since this is a more old-school dungeon crawling experience, some of these items can be cursed. So managing your inventory with scrolls to identify unidentified items or a scroll to remove curses become valuable, even though they're holding space you'd want for emergency replacement gear. The game is as much about handling the attack patterns of the enemies presented to you, of which their AI is simple to deal with, as it is about inventory management through manipulating your limited resources and minimizing contact between you and the enemy if you can help it. You're still motivated to fight enemies to acquire gold, since you spend it at shops and at healing fountains, and you're extra motivated to fight bosses because you're only capable of leveling up by fighting the boss and the keys that they drop open larger chests containing rare items and potions. On screen, the gameplay loop is evident. Cautiously explore your surroundings, preferably with a buddy, fight enemies when you have to, but avoid them if possible, find the boss fight and trigger the fight when you're ready, collect your spoils and the key to acquire a potentially good weapon, acquire resources from some of the remaining mobs, find your exit point and exit to find yourself halfway between this zone and the next with a bonfire to sit at. Acquire 20 HP from the time resting there, and then leave for your next trek into the dungeons. It's about time I covered the first choice a player makes in the game, and how each class works to make some fights easier to deal with over others, as well as the perk system that makes certain playstyles viable over others. As mentioned in the beginning of the video, a player can select from one of 5 distinct classes or a randomized skin holding a random set of skills from any of the classes. In order, we have the Knight, the Rogue, the Mage, the Wildling, and the Houndmaster. The Knight is a fighter class that starts off with a sword in their inventory and have this base stat spread. Their class skills involve making you better with the sword, giving you increased defenses with an invisible shield, or letting you unleash your inner paladin with built-in featherfall and beams of light. The Rogue is a rogue class that starts off with a bow and 20 arrows, as well as a dagger in their inventory. They have this base stat spread. Their class skills involve making your dagger usage better by increasing the damage thresholds and allowing you to throw the dagger, stealth in game and deal critical damage at later stages, or dodge roll. The Mage is a wizard class that starts off with a level 1 electric lance and frost nova, as well as a staff in their inventory. They have this base stat spread. Their class skills involve making you an alchemist with potions, making you more potent with them, enhancing the strength of staff so you start casting spells learned through them, making the spell casting itself an easier experience with fast casting and lower spell cooldowns, or becoming a proper enchanter by imbuing elements permanently into the weapon you're holding, and more importantly, the weapons of the friends you play with. The Wildling is a monk class that starts off with nothing. They have the highest base stat spread here. Their class skills involve making your fist attacks deal more damage with flurry of blows and such, berserk mode causing you to run quickly and deal more damage, or unlocking different animal aspects to deal with the enemy. The Houndmaster is a ranger class that starts off with a club and a good boy. They have the lowest base stat spread here. Their class skills can see you making your clubbing skills more effective, making your hound a more reactive combatant, or the rather funny option of making your hound into a ballistic missile of fangs and claws by chucking them at your opponents. Each class has a distinctive playstyle, and their perks inform what kind of theme they can motion towards. You could be an alchemist with your mage and forego spells altogether, instead chugging all manner of concoctions to become a super soldier, sinking your remaining perk points into strength to deal extra damage with an axe. You could play your rogue as the green arrow, rolling around to avoid damage from enemies while shooting your arrow to pierce opponents and bounce off walls. You could play the knight as a holy warrior sword saint, shooting beams of light with your slashes and spinning your way to victory. Or forego all of that and invest your time trying to make a random character work, looking at their base stat spreads and the class trees they have at their disposal and discovering what kind of hero they'll become. Once you've selected your class, you make your next big decision in the perk they'll have. Consider these the Fallout New Vegas starting traits, a certain effect or benefit that makes your character that much more tailored to your sensibilities. Don't like drinking potions of poison when testing out their effects? Take the Poison Drinker perk, and suddenly you have a second source of healing at the cost of making potions of regeneration less effective. Hate books? Become illiterate and bomb your enemies instead. Like mimics and need friends? Make all treasure chests into mimics that you can fling at your enemies to acquire their items like cracking open a piñata. Denying your body from earthly pleasures to achieve enlightenment? Become an ascetic and have gold dissolve at a touch in favor of having increased base stats. The perk system here adds an additional layer of customization to tailor your dungeon delving experiences to your needs. You could acquire the bookworm trait for your mage and gain 2 levels every time you read a book at the cost of losing strength, or you could be a mage with limited healing spell and live your fantasies as a thaumaturge. It's being boiled down since it's not including the use of keys for optional zones, or the rescuing of fairies that increase the healing potency of a campfire, or mimics and such, but you should get the idea that this game feels like a dungeon crawler while adding that sense of exploration and adventure. And you'll need all the stats you can get because the monsters in this game and the bosses are brutal. So I'm a big fan of the monsters and bosses found in this game, even if their AI is dumb, partially because they feel traditional for a fantasy game near the beginning and go off the deep end by the end of things. The basic enemies have defined and simplistic attack patterns, meaning a player should be quick to observe how they'll dish death and what to do to avoid it. Goblins here stab forward. Their attack window is about a weapon swing's worth before they attack, so you can attempt to temporarily daze them with a strong opening move. Bats begin to fly down from their roosts the moment you're in the area, and they deal damage by touching you, so it's more about positioning your attack to dispatch them than anything else. Slimes will shake and change color before charging forward with their bodies. Just covering the cave bosses, you've got the goblin leader, who's immune to traps and will attempt to grab the player to throw them far away. You've got the rockworm, who shoots a stream of poison from its mouth when they emerge from the walls and are spurred to attack if damaged, or you've killed 3 of its silkworm children. Finally, there's the dragon, who will be resting and wake up shooting fireballs and dazing players with its ground pound. There are a total of 16 bosses to fight, with 12 fights required for diligent players seeking a level up from descent to descent. Really, the game gets nuts with the boss fights, and are the highlight of showcasing the player's strengths because a player will need to know a lot of the boss's mechanisms to properly handle with ease. The environment hasn't been mentioned, but it plays a huge role in dealing with the monsters you face. That dragon I just mentioned is the easiest of the 3 bosses because you can bring him to a pool of water and smack him around while the fireballs get absorbed by the water. Crazier players might guide a rockworm to a body of water and shoot them with electricity, causing each segment of the rockworm to take a lot of damage and your player to take damage too. The Goblin King is susceptible to cheese strats with a bow or some free spells, but cheese can only get you so far when you make it into the catacombs and have to fight the damn skeleton dragon and abomination. Oh god! Crazy endgame bosses, of which I'll include just the one, is the Thunder God. He jabs you with his fists, causing the ground to quake, and you need to hurt his hands enough to cause him to temporarily expose his head and wallop on the guy. He's the easiest of the endgame bosses. The designs of these bosses at least show a lot of creativity and risk, even if some of the fights are just busted. Let us make mention of the art style of this game, as well as its music and level design. This game is beautiful. If it isn't watching the lonely carriage roll down the road as the trees run past behind the title screen with pleasant music playing in the background, it's getting off of the carriage to listen to the sounds of the natural world outside of the cave and sit still in the splendor of the opening moments of your adventure. The art does a fantastic job at readability for the player to know what kind of attack pattern a creature might have, while also retaining the distinctive whimsy that comes from engaging with a fantasy world. For the longest time, I had just considered these orange humanoids as bandits, but the indication in the credits that they were goblins only adjusted the nameplate. The name was irrelevant because I always knew at a glance that they were an aggressive creature that upon locking eyes with you, would chase you around the map to place their sword squarely through your body. When the game wants to be unsettling, they throw something like the Abomination, with its undulating tentacles dragging the great heft through the narrow hallways of the catacombs. If the game wants to be imposing, they throw something like the Thunder God, or the Black Knight, the former taking up such a large amount of the player's screen to look down on your bit character, while the latter actively hunts you down by jumping across shadows to smash down its large sword onto you, healing with its attacks if you get it low enough. But this art also maintains function. The developers do a great job of defining what exists in the foreground, midground, or background, platforms clearly identifiable for straightforward traversal. Traps, those pesky one-shot killers, are also easily identifiable when looking for those raised platforms or entrenched arrow traps in the walls, or the unmistakable presence of the spikes. And after traveling through a level, you receive a respite from the music and the action and sit to a warm and crackling campfire. Maybe you've saved a fairy on your way over and they leisurely walk around the campfire, a boon to morale that also increases the potency of the campfire you heal at. If you're transitioning from one biome to another, your campfire level denotes this transition either by indicating the encroaching vines and roots of the forest biome, or the damp and decrepit stonework of the catacombs biome. And your player is welcomed with new music upon each transition, the low drones coupled with distant water drops in the catacombs, or the uplifting notes of the forest yearning for you to climb higher and reach the tree's canopies. If you're bold enough, you can choose to enter distinct zones in the second stage of each main biome, including the ruins with its ghostly enemies, or the jungle with its winding paths, buzzsaws, and spinning fire-breathing turtles. These levels break up the monotony over time, and not only offer the player a chance to conquer challenges almost entirely unique to the level, but provide the player with an orb of power that increases their stats, each orb increasing a particular stat. Mind you, accessing these levels require you to forego the contents of the chest in the second stage, so mechanically, the game is purposefully making your character weaker to deal with these objectively harder levels. This should prompt the player to be considerate of all their options gained from stages 1 and 2 to even consider if their power level is enough to handle the alternate stages and acquire even greater power. And the less said about the final boss of this game, or its true final form, should your adventurers be brave enough to carry the 4 orbs from the alternative stages, the better. That's a treat I implore the lot of you to experience with your own skill if possible. Vagante is very special to me, in that it marries a lot of what I like in a dungeon crawler with the tactile nature of exploring said dungeon. There's an entirely different feeling that comes from being cognizant of game-ending traps on a given stage, moving slowly through an area because monsters are around, and you can't risk taking fall damage when jumping from tree to tree or ledge to ledge, over the first-person perspective of walking through corridors to find monsters in something like Etrian Odyssey, or comboing your way through mobs in Diablo. This is not to say those aforementioned games are bad for not emphasizing the setting as a character to interact with, just that I receive an altogether unique experience from Vagante that I haven't received anywhere else. I implore the lot of you that are listening to consider acquiring this game and playing it with friends if possible. The game also has a level creator option available for those creative enough to make additional stages for the community to experience. The developers of the game seem to be providing it with patches and updates, so the game is still being cared for, and the game was recently launched for the Switch and PS4 platforms, so even more people are capable of playing this wonderful game. Take the leap into this fantastical forgotten realm and become a wayward vagabond in Vagante today. This has been Mr. Staleman on Cavernous Connections carrying creatures and curiosities, locking off.